Okay, we are back. This is part 2 of our Flip It lectures, where I'm going to deliver some content to you in your dorm room, and that way it'll free up some time in class for us to have some discussions and to work through some of the more complex principles. All this stuff I'm about to tell you is just strict information. This is stuff you just have to memorize and learn, and it's really not that difficult. It's the central nervous system anatomy and basic functions. Now, when I test you in your neuroanatomy practicals in lab, sometimes I'll ask you for extra credit, what is the function of that structure? So learning these as soon as possible will help you to get extra credit on those lab practicals. All right, so let's start out and talk about what is the function of the brain. And if we were in class, I'd be calling on somebody to tell me something the brain does, right? What's the basic function that the brain does? Well, the basic function that the brain does is to maintain our biological activity, to keep us alive. Things like circulation, respiration, digestion, excretion, all of that stuff that we don't think about. Our brain's in control of that. It's subconscious, typically. Although we can sometimes take control. Everybody in here can hold your breath if you feel like it, but usually respiration is subconscious. It also does cognition. This is the process of knowing. This is what we think about our brain doing as its sort of primary purpose. Reasoning, emotion, perceptions of our environment, thought processes. And communication is very important to carry out these functions, right? And our brain has 2 primary ways that it's going to communicate in your body: chemical and electrical signals. Okay? We have an endocrine system. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about reproduction and we talk about stress, hormones. But we're primarily going to focus on the nervous system, which is both chemical and electrical. Endocrine system, just chemical. Nervous system, chemical and electrical. So the endocrine system consists of a series of glands that release chemicals into the bloodstream. And when those chemicals get released in the bloodstream, they go everywhere in your body. Everywhere. And that's a benefit of the endocrine system. It is widespread and far acting. We call these chemicals hormones. So anytime we release chemicals in the blood, the name is a hormone. And again, this has widespread effects. It's relatively slow because it relies on your blood supply to carry the hormones to the different targets. But it's also sustained and it lasts a long time, right? So good for changing overall states. Stress, for instance, we release adrenaline. We're going to upregulate. We're going to make all kinds of changes in cells in our body in a stress state for a sustained period of time until those hormones go away. The nervous system uses both electrical and chemical signaling. Is comprised of cells called neurons. They form a network. Electrical signals are used within a neuron. However, as I mentioned in the first day of class, Ramon E. Kayel figured out that there are small gaps or synapses in between our neurons. So in between neurons, the neurons release chemicals called neurotransmitters that are a chemical signal between the neurons. So electrical within a neuron, chemical between a neuron. All right. So as I mentioned, we're going to focus primarily on the nervous system and its signaling. And this is what we're going to talk about next week, is how this chemical and electrical signaling works. It's so crucial and important that you understand next week. It is literally the fundamental elements of this course. And we'll take our time and go smoothly and slowly through it so that you can really get a good grasp. All right, for now, we're just going to focus on some structural stuff. Like I said, basic information. So the nervous system can be broken down into 2 parts. We have the central nervous system, which is everything here in the brain and in the spinal cord. So anything in your skull and spinal cord, spinal column is called the central nervous system. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is everything outside of your skull and your spine. There's some fundamental differences between the central and the peripheral nervous system, and we're going to talk more about those on Thursday. Okay? For right now, I want to focus on the central nervous system. And here we see a picture of the brain, and one of the important things anytime we see a picture of brain is we want to orientate ourselves. So here's the longitudinal fissure separating the two cerebral hemispheres, so we know that we're looking at the top or the dorsal side of the brain. And if we were to slice directly through the midline of the brain, this is what the brain would look like if we were looking at it from the side. Okay, and we're going to focus on these areas down here in the base of the brain called the hindbrain first. So we'll focus on the pons, medulla, and cerebellum, and the reticular formation, their jobs. All right, here's just another picture of the same thing. I'm going to show you lots of pictures. You can see the cerebellum back here. It's very kind of funny shaped, almost tree-like dendrites and pattern in here. The pons is sort of a bulge or belt-like structure, and then we have the medulla, which is leading into the spinal cord. Again, just some different pictures of the brain, the hindbrain, and nuclei within the hindbrain. So within the hindbrain, there are nuclei that are primarily concerned with basic life functions, right? With things like heart rate, breathing, vomiting, being alert, those sorts of things. All right. Hold on, let me back up for that for just 1 minute. And so this slide, number 6, a lot of these slides are just good reference slides to write down. Say slide 6 in this talk shows me where brainstem nuclei like the raphe nucleus is located, the locus ceruleus, we will talk about that later. Things like the reticular formation are located here in green or the vestibular nucleus or cochlear nucleus when we talk about balance and hearing. Right, so it's a good reference slide. All right, what do these things do? The pons and medulla, as I mentioned, contain nuclei. They're very important to keeping you alive. Right? The reticular formation deep inside the medulla was sort of that green shaded nucleus. Controls sort of your general state of activity in your brain. And so, what does James Bond do in the movie when he sneaks up behind the bad guy and he wants to knock him out? He gives him a karate chop or hits him with his gun right in the base of the back of the head. That's damaging your reticular formation, shocking your reticular formation, and it knocks you out. And if you do it hard enough, you can die or could result in a coma. And so damage to the medulla by drugs or trauma are very, very serious, usually producing unconsciousness, coma, and death. And in fact, basal skull fracture is what ended the life of the race car driver Dale Earnhardt Sr. And after his crash, they developed a new system called the Hans system that goes around the driver's necks that keeps their head from having too much momentum from their body so that it doesn't snap and break the skull and damage this very important area. All right. Other things the hindbrain does. The hindbrain contains the nuclei for the cranial nerves. There are 12 cranial nerves, 1 through 12. You're going to learn them next week for neuroanatomy. We have several mnemonic devices to help you learn them. And these nerves handle our sensory systems as well as all of our motor and sensory control of anything above our neck, so essentially our head. Also involved with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which we'll talk a little bit more about on Thursday. Peripheral nervous system parts. As I mentioned, there are 12 of them. They're numbered in order from rostral to caudal, front to back. And they're important in clinical testing because if you lose function of particular cranial nerves, we can pinpoint is the damage in the brain or the swelling in the brain closer to the front or the back of the brain. All right, so here they are, the 12 cranial nerves. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You see them numbered up here, 1 through 12. And again, you'll need to know this. You'll be able to identify these nerves by their names and their functions next week on the second week of neuroanatomy. Notice that many of them come out of the pons, some of them come out of the medulla, some come out of the midbrain up here. So here is the plate, 5.7 on page 85. I have to double check if that's right, page 85. So I think you have a new version of that textbook, so it might be slightly different. But this is the image that I will use. I will erase all of the names on there, but this is exactly what I'll use to quiz you on the cranial nerves. Not hard, see? You just have to memorize that. Alright, so this is a summary of the function of the cranial nerves. Now you'll notice some of the cranial nerves are what we call afferent signals. Anyone know what afferent means? Afferent means incoming. Okay, that means it's sensory coming in. So here, for instance, with the trigeminal nerve, we have touch and pain, red signals coming in, right? Vision, signals coming in. Smell, signals coming in red. Blue lines show efferent signals. Here, the oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens nerves, 3, 4, and 6, all control your eye muscles. Efferent eye muscle control. Efferent means outgoing. So think about this mnemonic device. A for afferent comes before E for efferent. Therefore, we have to have an input come in, and then we make a motor response. Okay? Maybe that helps you keep efferent and afferent straight. You'll notice that some nerves are what we call mixed nerves. So cranial nerve 5 not only has touch and pain from the face, but it also controls jaw muscles. Right? So we can have mixed nerves as well. Okay. Hindbrain, cerebellum. We haven't talked about the good old cerebellum back here. Highly complex little structure. So it's sometimes called the little brain. That's what cerebellum means. It's related to coordinated movement. It's very sensitive to drug damage. It's one of the first places that alcohol starts to affect the brain. So alcohol starts on the surface of the brain and then creeps in towards more subcortical or deeper structures the more alcohol you have. So the lack of coordination and balance is due to alcohol's effect on the cerebellum. These neurons here have really big dendritic fields. Now, this is not a real fair question. Why? Because we haven't talked about neurons and parts of a neuron yet. But I'm going to teach you how the different parts of the neuron can tell you something about what that neuron's job is. So if I tell you that dendrites are the input coming into a neuron, and axons are the output, and the soma, or a purple body here, cell body, is the decision maker, you could look at this neuron and say, hey, this neuron's getting a lot of input from a lot of different places, it's making a decision, and then it sends a single decision, a single output out. Right? So if you think about coordinating sensory and motor movement in order to execute a proper motor movement, this is the sort of system you would expect. Okay, midbrain. Moving on up, just above the hindbrain, we have the midbrain. The midbrain consists of two sets of bumps that we call the superior colliculus up here and the inferior colliculus down here. The superior and inferior colliculus in the human brain are much smaller than in the sheep's brain. In particular, the superior colliculus is very big in the sheep's brain. It's going to look a little different, but two sets of bumps on either side of the midline. Here you can kind of see the midline and the superior colliculus, two bumps. The inferior colliculus will be behind it. Right? Superior colliculus involved with orientating our head to vision tracking. Inferior colliculus orientating our head to sounds, sound localization. The tegmentum down here is involved with eye movement and control. This is where we have the nuclei for those cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 that help control our eye movements. And then the substantia nigra, this area here on either side, is the dopamine input into the basal ganglia, which are located up here in the forebrain. And what's important about the substantia nigra is that when we start to talk about movement and movement disorders, in Parkinson's disease, these are the neurons that die. The substantia nigra dopamine input dies coming into the basal ganglia, and that's what results in the behavioral deficits of Parkinson's disease. All right. Moving on up to midbrain, forebrain, we'll look at some lateral structures, meaning that these are out here away from the midline, buried inside your cortex. And we have inside the temporal lobe the hippocampus, which is involved with learning and memory, not storage of memories, but creating memories. Just in front of it, this blue structure is the amygdala. It's called that because of its almond shape. The amygdala is associated with assigning emotional value to stimuli. So whether you love your boyfriend and he's great, then the amygdala is involved in assigning that positive value to your boyfriend or girlfriend. And after you have a nasty breakup, you can't stand to see them and you get this visceral hate feeling. Okay, that change happened in the amygdala. It assigns emotional value. Also, the amygdala is very important when we talk about addiction because the emotional value assigned to drugs changes in the amygdala. The thalamus here is a sensory filtering station. A lot of times you'll see in textbooks it's a relay. It's not a relay. A relay means it just hands the signal off to the next level. Here it actually filters the incoming sensory information. And the thalamus is where things like adaptation occur. So right now, if your air conditioner's running or there's some sound in your room, you weren't particularly paying attention to it, but when I call your attention to it, all of a sudden you can hear it. That's the thalamus filtering out or letting information through. And finally, below the thalamus is the hypothalamus that controls all the nuclei for those homeostatic systems that we talked about. Sex and reproduction, eating, digestion, hunger, satiety, body temperature, water, thirst, all of those areas, sleep-wake cycle, all that found in the hypothalamus. All right. Moving on up. Now we are into the cerebral cortex. Here's the thalamus again. We have one on either side. We have the cortex. It has a series of grooves, which we call sulci, or sulcus is singular. And then it has this cortical area, which we call gyri or gyrus for singular. This is the corpus callosum right here. Oh, let me pull in my other things. So, again, thalamus, hypothalamus. Down here we have the pituitary gland connected by the infundibulum to the hypothalamus. A lot of homeostatic things in the hypothalamus, sleep-wake cycle, hunger, digestion, sex and reproduction, need to communicate to glands in our body. And they do so through the pituitary gland by releasing hormones that then travel to those glands. Okay, so we have the cerebral cortex, and in particular, right above the corpus callosum, which is the connection, the axon connection, the wire, if you will, the cable between the left and the right hemispheres, is this very first gyrus called the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus is important because it's involved with emotion, attention to emotional stimuli, determining emotional responses, that sort of thing. There's my label for the corpus callosum, this yellow looking thing here. Way back here in the back part of the brain, right above the superior and inferior colliculi, is a singular structure called the pineal gland. Pineal gland is one of the only structures in the brain that's not duplicated. We have a left and a right superior and inferior colliculus. Right? We have a left and right hemisphere. We have a left and right thalamus. We have left and right hypothalamic nuclei. The pineal gland is a single structure right on the midline. It turns out the pineal gland is not so important in the brain. It's involved with releasing melatonin, which is involved with our sleep-wake cycle. But in the old days, when people just looked at the brain, they thought, oh, this must be really important. And for instance, Descartes thought that this was where the soul existed because there was only one of it. It turns out that it was not. All right. If we look here at the front of the brain, top of the brain, bottom of the brain, we're orientating. Here's our midline. Here we can see these lateral structures. The pink structure back here on either side is the hippocampus, right? Here's the cingulate gyrus wrapping around. We have the thalamus underneath on either side. The green is the hypothalamus down here. We have things called mammillary bodies down there. We'll learn more about that in lab today on Wednesday. And we have the amygdala here sitting in front of the hypothalamus. All of the ones shown in blue, cingulate, mammillary, amygdala, olfactory bulbs, are considered the limbic system and are involved with emotion. We have sensory motor regulation through the thalamus, And we have learning and memory through the hippocampus. And we have internal body states through the hypothalamus. All right. So I've already mentioned this on the other slides, but just to kind of summarize, the hypothalamus does daily rhythms, basic motivated behaviors. The pituitary is called the master gland because it receives signals from the hypothalamus and then releases different hormone signals that act on the endocrine system. So if you were to get highly aroused in your brain and your brain wanted to activate your stress system, then your hypothalamus would trigger the pituitary gland to release a chemical called ACTH. That chemical hormone would then travel to your adrenal gland and cause cortisol or adrenaline to be released and then go act throughout the body. So it's sort of a multi-step process where the pituitary is the master gland controlling the functioning of other glands. The thalamus, as I mentioned, sorts and filters incoming sensory information. Hippocampus forms long-term memories. It stores some memories like maps, spatial memory, but typically it's involved with forming memories in neural networks in the temporal lobe. All right, I mentioned these nuclei before in the brainstem. Well, first let me mention the nucleus basileus is a nucleus here right near the hypothalamus, involved with sleep-wake cycle, okay, and involved in attention and sleep regulation. Back here, though, in the hindbrain, we have in blue the locus ceruleus, we have in gray the raphe nucleus, and then in green we have, big word, pontomesencephalon, or the reticular formation. All right, we will talk more about these areas when we talk about the neurotransmitters that they release. The locus ceruleus is releasing norepinephrine in the brain. The raphe nucleus is releasing serotonin in the brain. We'll talk more about that when we get to neurotransmitters. Okay, cerebral cortex. Cortex means covering. This is the outside of the brain. It's composed of what we call gray matter, which has the cell bodies and dendrites. The cell bodies and dendrites are organized in 6 different layers of the cortex, and they're organized in columns, functional columns, from the top to the internal part of the cortex, from the surface down. Inside the surface is what we call white matter. These are the axons or connections between different areas of the cortex. They're called white matter because they're insulated with some fat, and so they actually look white when you cut the brain open, whereas the gray matter looks, well, gray. The cortex is divided into 2 hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and in general, the left hemisphere controls the right side of your body, right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. We call that contralateral connections. We just like to make things difficult. The corpus callosum, as I mentioned, is a major connection between the 2 hemispheres and allows communication so that we have one singular brain and not 2 separate brains. Each hemisphere is organized into 4 lobes or regions, and each of those 4 lobes or regions have particular functions. We'll talk about the destination for sensory input, the origin of motor output, and cognition that occurs there. So here's a picture of a real human brain. You see your cerebellum, your brain stem down here, and here we see the cortex. The cortex is by far the biggest part of the brain. As I mentioned, it has 2 hemispheres. Here's looking at the top. We can see the left and the right hemisphere. The corpus callosum inside here connects, bundle of axons that connects. If we cut down through the longitudinal fissure, the midline, and look at it, here it is. It's not purple. It's actually white. It's just colored in purple to emphasize where it's located here on this particular diagram. If we were to make a cut, what we call coronally, on this blue line through the brain like this, right, and we were to look at your brain cut, right, this is the type of diagram we would get. And again, you see the gray matter on the surface. There's 6 layers from the surface to the deep side. And then you see white matter that are connecting different parts of the cortex and even connecting left and right hemispheres. And there's all sorts of pathways in there. We'll learn some of the pathways. We won't learn all of them, obviously. All right, so here, this is a top-down view. Front of the brain, back of the brain, midline, left, right, that labels every single gyrus and sulcus. So all you have to know for your first exam is the names and how to label. I'm just kidding. You don't have to know that. Everybody take a deep breath. Write down. Slide 22 is my reference slide. If I want to know where the supramarginal gyrus is, go to slide 22. It'll show me. Okay? There are some that you'll need to know. They are listed in your neuroanatomy packet, but you do not need to know all of these. Same sort of thing, slide 23, reference slide for the side of the brain. So you have to be looking at the left side, the right side's identical in terms of the naming of the brain, and so good reference slide for you. All right, let's talk about the lobes, and then we'll talk about the sensory motor system, and then we'll be done. Okay. The first lobe we're going to talk about is the back 1/3 of the brain, shown here in this sort of light blue. It's called the occipital lobe, and this is almost exclusively used for vision and vision processing. So look how much of the brain is devoted to vision. Vision is a very complex cognitive task, taking nerve signals from our eyes and recreating our rich perception of the world, binocular depth and movement and colors, and assigning meaning is very, very complex. We devote a big chunk of our brain to visual processing. Just in front of the occipital lobe, down here on the posterior part of the brain, underneath the lateral sulcus, right here, we find the temporal lobe. And these are 3 gyri you need to know: superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. The temporal lobe is where our hearing is located. It's also where our memories are stored. There's also some internal areas inside the lateral sulcus called the insular lobe, where taste processing or gustatory processing occurs. Moving upward, dorsally from the occipital lobe, we find the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe contains a gyrus, which is right behind the central sulcus. So this is the central sulcus, divides the brain centrally. And the first gyrus behind it is called the postcentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus is our primary touch cortex. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Part of the parietal lobe. The rest of the visual processing and visual awareness and responding to visual stimuli. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about dorsal streams out of the visual cortex and ventral streams into the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe involved with what am I seeing, recognition, memory. The parietal pathway involved with how do I respond to it, what do I do with that visual stimulus. Finally, we get to the frontal lobe, shown in purple. This also includes the precentral gyrus, which is our motor cortex. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then everything else up here is involved with the highest complex cognitive processes: personality, emotion, reasoning, decision making, value judgment, appreciation of art. And what's amazing is that those things are what we think about the brain doing. Yet, look, only about 1/3 of the brain is devoted to these higher cognitive orders. The rest of the brain is pretty much devoted to sensory systems and memory. Okay, so speaking about sensory systems, here we see a nice summary of where all the sensory systems are located. As I said, vision, occipital lobe, hearing, temporal lobe, superior temporal gyrus, olfaction comes into frontal lobe, and then our general body senses, not just the hand, but all of our peripheral senses come into the somatosensory cortex and the postcentral gyrus, and our motor control of all that comes out of the precentral gyrus. All All right, and so all of these functions are found duplicated on both sides of the brain, and as I mentioned, the left side controls the right. The left side of the brain controls the right body. Right side of the brain controls the left body. So we have motor cortex, sensory cortex. All of these cortices are duplicated, found on both sides of the brain. Some functions are not duplicated. So we'll talk about language and how in 90% of the population, language is lateralized, meaning it's only found in one part of the brain, that happens to be in the left hemisphere. It's such a complex processing function to identify and recognize language and produce language that we don't want to have two areas duplicated trying to do that. So we have one lateralized area, but most of these lower functions are duplicated. All right, so as I mentioned, it's confusing. I know it's confusing, but you'll get the hang of it. Right brain controls left body, left brain controls right body. Damage the right motor cortex, you can't move your left body. Okay? So that's the way it works. It's contralateral. Now, if we were to take and look at the brain from up above, okay, dorsal view, central sulcus, here we see the motor cortex, here we see the somatosensory cortex. If we were to take each of those and cut through it and look at it from the corpus callosum, wrap around to the lateral sulcus, this would be temporal lobe down here, we see that we get an organization of the body that goes from our toes, up our legs, our trunk, our hands, our arms, up to our face. Right? And we have that for the sensory system, and we have the same sort of organization for our motor system. So the frontal lobe has the motor cortex, the parietal lobe has the sensory cortex, somatosensory cortex, right? They're adjacent to one another, and that makes sense. Something touches my toe, I want to move my toe, I want to be able to communicate just across the central sulcus about that. You'll also notice that the areas are not evenly distributed. They're not evenly distributed. So they're organized by body part, from toes to face, from the midline out to the lateral part. It's uneven. We have a lot more distribution for our face and for our hands. Right? And this is because the more cortex we devote to an area, the greater processing power we have. Our most sensitive areas of our body are our face and our hands. And the areas that we have the best motor control over are our fingers and hands and our face. Think about talking and what has to happen with your lips and your tongue and breathing and your teeth. Very, very small, fine motor movements have to happen in order to produce speech. That takes a lot of processing power in the motor cortex and a lot of feedback from the somatosensory cortex. If we were proportionally, our body parts are proportional to our brain areas, this is what we would look like. And it's called the homunculus, and it's a body map based on the amount of brain area that is devoted to that. We have very little brain area devoted to our trunk. It's relatively insensitive. We don't really use our trunk to explore the world, much more for our hands and fingers. All right, there we go. Review points for this lecture. You should understand all of these points. If you don't, that's the time to hit me up with an email and say, Dr. Pittman, I don't understand the function of the hypothalamus, and I can explain that to you. All right, this is going to conclude this lecture. I will see you in lab where we will do the surface structures of the sheep brain. Spelling counts, to start learning how to spell those words. I'll be a little lenient on the first one, but spelling counts, people. All right. I hope you have a good rest of tonight or tomorrow, and I will see you at 2 o'clock in the neuroscience lab, Millikan 228.